Friedrich Kellner was a social democrat who found himself living in the National Socialist Third Reich. He kept a diary which reads like a real-life version of Orwell's 1984. I highly recommend Kellner's diary and Orwell's 1984 for anyone interested, but today we're going to take a few quotes from Kellner's diary and assess them, much like we did recently with Goebbels' diaries. While Kellner certainly has a limited perspective and is a social democrat, and thus is one of the very few people in the Third Reich that actually oppose the regime, as he himself says, one thing he does get right are the conditions in the Third Reich itself. So, while he talks about the battles and the propaganda and many other things, we're just going to focus on the living conditions, and more specifically, the food and oil crisis going on in the Third Reich. And at the end of the video, as a bit of a bonus, I'm going to send you to another video where another survivor of the Third Reich speaks up about the conditions under the Nazi regime. An absolutely brilliant video which somehow, shamefully, has less than 3,000 views. Shout out to the person who gave me the link recently. Anyway, let's take a look at what Friedrich Kellner wrote during the war, and straight away, as early as mid-September 1939, the war was already impacting the living conditions of the people. Depressed mood. The war measures are burdening people's minds. In particular, the strictly carried out blackouts greatly discomfort everyone. Those in agriculture are extra encumbered. To make up for the shortage of day labourers who have been called into the military, they have to work late into the evening, but they are not allowed to illuminate their house, yard, cellar, barn or stable as in former times. In the evenings now, a dead silence reigns throughout our entire small town. The old folks are afraid to go out onto the streets because of the darkness. An unusual peace prevails on the highways. Motorized Germany sleeps. Beginning September 20th, only vehicles designated as having special permission may be driven. But conditions were already bad before this. What cardinal errors has the Nazi tyranny made? 1. The enforced greeting Hail Hitler. 2. Splitting the people into party members and non-party members. 3. One-sided control of public opinion, meaning a press with just one voice. 4. Suppressing free expression of opinion. Sounds like 2020. 5. Protecting the old fighters and party members even if they are criminals. 6. Persecuting decent citizens only because they once had another opinion and perhaps refer to the Nazis as an abscess. 7. Persecution and extermination of the Jews. Bearing in mind that this is 1939 and there's no Allied propaganda. Deniers claim that Allied propaganda was the true origin of the Holocaust, and yet here we clearly have evidence that contradicts that. 8. Disrespect for people's religious convictions. 9. Continuously changing the laws, new laws in great volumes and thousands of regulations, even specialists can no longer keep up with their own subjects. 10. Unbelievable over-organisation in the nation and in particular in the party and its institutions. This one is also interesting since Kellner was a social democrat and thus was also calling for an organising of society. 11. Dreadfully unproductive offices and a bloated bureaucracy. Again, Kellner shouldn't be complaining about that. 12. Irresponsible expenditures without taking income into consideration. 13. Protecting the worst people in the state, pardons, etc. 14. Tax burden without end. Again, Kellner can't complain. 15. Mendicants in bulk, NSV, WHW, badges, etc. The NSV is the National Socialist People's Welfare Organisation, and the WHW is the Winter Relief of the German People Organisation. 16. Easy sinecures and benefits for Nazi Party members, minor offices, utensils, uniforms, toys, circus, fanfares, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. 17. The Führer commands and we follow. And 18. We owe everything to our Führer. Well, they should have begged the Führer for more, because even in the first winter, things weren't going so well for the German people, as these next passages make clear. Clothing drive, despite clothing ration cards, toy collections too. In short, nationally organised begging. The clothing collector, Fraulein Ruschen, says she also takes money. Then, in the January of 1940, there was a coal shortage, as Goebbels explains. The coal problem is reaching very serious proportions. We must take drastic steps. If necessary, close schools and theatres. Very distressing to me. The Reichsbahn has let us down completely. I issue an explanatory circular to the Gau authorities. Then later, yesterday, even heavier frost. Coal situation desperate, now we have to shut the theatres, cinemas and studios. This is a natural catastrophe against which one cannot succeed by normal means. The Reichsbahn is powerless. This is probably what prompted this. Yesterday evening, local group leader Pott gathered his little flock of sheep once again for a comforting lecture about the scarcity of coal. According to him, we have enough coal. We have none at all. It is merely a question of transportation, and the severe winter can also be blamed, the frozen rivers and railway switches. This is interesting because the Germans actually had plenty of coal reserves. As Kellner and Goebbels and others correctly point out, the issue wasn't the reserves, but the Reichsbahn, the nationalised German railway organisation, which was meant to have shipped the coal to where it was needed. It appears that, even at this early stage, the Reichsbahn wasn't doing its job, and coal wasn't the only thing in short supply. Paper shortage. We have to reduce the size of newspapers again. Don't forget the fuel crisis. The highways, which are obviously maintained, lie so beautifully quiet. Motorized Germany, as the National Socialist salesman called it several years ago, has turned away from the automobile. My forecast promptly arrived. When the autobahns are finished, we will have no gasoline. But no one believed me. And labour was in short supply too. The agriculture sector has problems finding enough skilled workers, but yet in the cities and villages, millions of people just hang about and wait for miracles. World conqueror, you have been robbed of your reason. At seed distribution time, farmers received just 50% of the clover seeds they ordered. Yet, Herr Dairy will nevertheless win the production battle. On paper, that is. If only there were no more paper. What a lucky thing that would be for our people. But the paper war stands in full bloom, and the party appears to have tremendous supplies of it. As Gunter Reimann made clear in The Vampire Economy, the bureaucratic machine of the regime made its mark on everyone. Kellner confirms this. An outsider does not see the jumble of interconnections that make up the Nazi Party's organisation. Its federations and associations at ground level, all devilishly cunning in the way it is drawn up, in which the many department heads have total command and grind down the people. Such power arouses the criminal nature, and there are no noble men among them. To be the proper fighter, one must be brutal. Naturally, once these wretches get a post, they strive to keep it. So, the sum of such creatures, job seekers, materialists, lazy bums, results in a strong bloc, where one supports the other. Everyone realises that everything depends on the whole. And that is where their strength lies, and also their weakness, as the large number of party members includes a large number of scoundrels. Were these scoundrels the cause of the food crisis? Well, I won't spoil it, but the video I'll be linking to at the end pretty much confirms this, as does other books like Colingham's The Taste of War. Price capping policies demotivated farmers from growing fruit and vegetables. And grocers passed on to their customers the cost of the hefty bribes they were forced to pay wholesalers in order to persuade them to release their limited stocks of vegetables. Imports were cut due to the war and the pre-war autarky policy, which led to a spiral of poor harvests. In addition, the economy was centrally planned, and farmers had to obey what their masters told them, which you'll hear more about in the video I'll link at the end. All this led to some ridiculous policies which further destroyed farming output. For example, in order to not reduce the meat ration, they slaughtered more pigs, which meant once the pigs were consumed, there was less meat and fat in the diet. So the Germans had to eat more potatoes, which just happens to be the diet for the pigs, meaning that potato rations had to be cut to feed the pigs, which then led them to be slaughtered faster, reducing both potato and pork production over time. bearing in mind that the situation before the war for the pig and cattle farmers was already stupid, so the agricultural sector was already suffering. Now, the better paid war industries also drew workers away from the farming sector, and a terrible supply and distribution system made things worse overall. And this is just some of the issues they faced. So yes, bureaucratic and party scoundrels were the cause for the food crisis. We had a salad lunch for 80 Reich pfennigs in the restaurant at the stock exchange. It was a meat-free day. The businesses are completely closed one day of the week. The activity in the shops cannot be compared with former times. I searched without success in different stores for sandals. Many electric street cars are being run by women conductors. In response to a question I asked at the Schumann restaurant, I was told they now serve meals only starting at 6 in the evening. Kellner finally found sandals on the 27th of June, noting that the sales lady said they'd only received 3 pairs in total. Later, when one of his friends gave his opinion that the war would be finished within a few weeks, his friend's wife said, "Then everything will be available again." While this next quote is not specific to the 1940 period, the shoe shortage was still a problem in 1941, as Goebbels makes clear here. I make 140 million cigarettes from the NSV stocks available for Berlin. We are also raising production slightly. We cannot let this calamity continue completely unchallenged. There are also great problems with clothing. It is impossible to buy the amount specified on the ration card, and there are no shoes at all. But we cannot do much about it. Back in 1940, things though were getting worse for Kellner. A report from a regional economic ministry states, because of increased export commitments, the coal situation, which primarily was a transportation problem this past winter, will be a major quantity problem in 1940-1941. It requires little insight to see the coming coal problem will be both one of transportation and shortages. We can thank our Führer for that. If things were going right, such announcements would not be necessary. Understandably, the shortages have to be addressed. The responsibility remains the same. Yeah, but don't worry, the Super Aryan Super Saiyans Goebbels and Hess were on the case. We, Goebbels and Hess, are both worried about the coal situation, and so we decide to join forces and try to do something. I hope we succeed in putting some urgency into the issue. Despite numerous videos on the oil crisis of the Third Reich, I still get some people insisting that there was no oil crisis and that I'm making it all up. But Kellner doesn't seem to think I am. At the war's very beginning, all-encompassing restrictions were placed throughout the land on oil and gasoline. A large number of trucks of every kind had to be turned over to the army, which resulted in limited public traffic. Gasoline supplies were confiscated. The sale of gasoline was placed under federal control. Controls were placed on the use of motor vehicles, only those with a red triangle sign were allowed on the road. Such is motorized Germany after 1 year and 40 days of war. All these restrictions on commercial traffic show how much we are feeling the pinch. Fuel is our problem child. The deepest well is empty. We were always dependent on many kinds of raw material which we imported in huge quantities even during peacetime. Because of a lack of storage here, our supplies were limited and always in need of replenishment. We might be able to advance the manufacture of fuel from coal, but with war increasing our consumption, we will not be able to do without imports. It does not require any further investigation to see how widely the deficiencies are felt. Measures taken by our war administration speak volumes. The military occupation of important strategic positions in Romania and securing waterways at the Danube and Black Sea show we have the same motives as when we last waged war against Romania in 1916. Of course, the fuel crisis was having an impact on the food crisis, even if the Reich's leaders were confident in their ultimate success. Dari has made a speech dealing with our food situation. We are well placed in this respect, it seems. What's interesting is that, according to reports from the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, a German worker's family member consumed more calories in the year 1940 than they did in 1939, but this dropped significantly by 1941 and 1942 from 2,445 calories to 1,928 calories. Apparently, widespread transgressions are occurring against the ban on feeding animals grains used in making bread. Regulation for the guarantee of bread cereals requirements from July 22, 1937. So, word has come from on high that posters have to be hung to remind us of the fodder prohibition and to point out its relevance to the war. It is worth noting, precautions for the guarantee of bread cereals were announced back in 1937. Now, posters have to be put up to achieve this. The paper war shall help. Clearly, if farmers had other food supplies for their animals, there would not have to be a prohibition on bread grains. That is exactly the crucial point. Instead of informing the farmers on what is yet available to feed their animals, they hang these posters in front of their noses. Posters instead of animal feed. Speaking of animal feed, bird feed for our canaries is no longer available. We have this Greater Germany indeed, and plan to create a new order in Europe. Order equals robbery. Yet so many things of daily living are scarce or not obtainable at all. I am not referring to luxuries. For example, even cleaning rags are not to be found. Hundreds of other articles require substitutes or are entirely gone. Where have you gone, you good old days? So Goebbels was wrong. Der Reich was not prepared for this. Kellner, who had actually read Mein Kampf, unlike many of his contemporaries, could see what Hitler's solution to the Third Reich troubles was. If in the near future Germany does not dominate the seas, it will be forced to search for another way out, which will be in the east. All the raw materials Adolf Hitler so urgently needs are there. On this basis, and if Russia does not volunteer to give us everything we want, Hitler will start the war in the east. But until the Reich conquered the Soviet Union, they were all going to go hungry. Bakker gives a report on the food situation. Meat is going to have to be cut by 100 grams per week from 2nd of June. This is confirmed by Kellner. The next meat rationing card will be good for a total of 1,600 grams from June 2nd through June 29th. The amount of meat for one person for that 4-week period. That means a reduction of 400 grams, 100 grams weekly, compared to what we now get. The paper shortage was also getting worse. I was informed in a private letter a considerable number of newspapers will discontinue publication soon to slow down the already perceptible depletion of paper. First in line to disappear will be those papers the party does not control. Anything not 100% for National Socialism is finished. It would have been much better had they shown a strong character in 1933 and stopped publishing, rather than the cringing servility and toadism they have gone through during this sad time. Notice that even though there were non-state newspapers, that all newspapers were either controlled directly by the state or were going along with the state. Well, it's worth noting that the same principle applied to all other businesses in the Third Reich, as I've explained in previous videos. They may have appeared to be independent businesses, but in reality they were not. To assess the availability of bicycles, the head of every household must fill out a form. And because of a noticeable shortage of beverages in many inns, only beer will be available on Sundays. Also, 0.2 litres of wine, 6.5 ounces, costs 60 or 70 pfennigs, despite the price commissioner. Price commissioner or price commissar? A member of the old guard, Josef Wagner, was appointed price commissar. He has a huge administrative staff at his disposal and keeps in close touch with the police to ensure the effectiveness of his decisions. His job is to fix both wholesale and retail prices for raw materials as well as for finished goods. What about health commissars? Notifications about deaths in the mental care facility in Hamadar have recently increased. Supposedly incurable patients are being brought to this institution, and they are soon to begin building a crematorium. Later, the mental hospitals have become murder centres. As I learned, a family brought their mentally deranged son back home from an institution. After some time, they received a letter from the sanatorium informing them their son had died and his cremated ashes were being sent to them. The office clerk had forgotten to strike this boy's name from the death list. From that oversight, the intended and premeditated murder came to light. Actually, by itself, this doesn't necessarily prove that it was murder. It could have just been an admin error. But we have other evidence that murder was happening at Hamadar and other places, with Hitler himself acknowledging this. When one of the Berlin professors approved euthanasia, the sentence was carried out. The selected patients were then shipped to holding facilities and then ultimately to one of 6 psychiatric extermination centers: Hartheim, Hadamar, Sonnenstein, Grafenegg, Brandenburg and Bernburg. Up to 100,000 German psychiatric inmates were killed before Hitler ended the official program late in 1941. In response to criticism from the public and religious leaders, Hitler withdrew his official approval from the euthanasia program and turned his attention to the Holocaust. However, local state hospital doctors continued killing the patients within the state hospitals themselves, destroying another 70,000 inmates. Yes, it seems there were 2 worlds in the Third Reich: the official and the unofficial. The shortage of all necessities has led to bartering. To obtain additional rations, people with something to barter follow the law of self-preservation. The farmer who goes to an honest city merchant with his fresh farm produce will never return home empty-handed. Merchandise wins out over money. It was different in the last war when paper currency was able to induce money-hungry farmers to furnish us with food. Bartering of merchandise is the way to do it today. The officials are trying to stop the devaluation of the economy, but there is no success in sight. Both the self-sufficient and the controlled economy are preparing for defeat in this war, which hopefully will have a sobering and cleansing effect for all time. Yes, contrary to some people's beliefs, the Third Reich was printing currency, inflation, which in turn caused price rises. They tried to get around this in numerous ways, which I won't get into here, but the point is that the official economy was failing to cope. According to a January 6, 1942 confidential memorandum from the Minister of Justice, the agricultural bureaucracy's fuel quota has been shortened in order to fulfill fuel requirements at the front. If the farms were in private hands, as some claim, why was there a bureaucracy? I'm just asking. The cutbacks are so big they will gravely decrease the allotment for official vehicles not involved in food production or manufacture. Our bailiff, for instance, will not receive any more fuel. The party circles were informed yesterday evening that a commission will inspect all basements for potato supplies. They are looking for surplus potatoes. Kellner therefore responded with the only thing he had: sarcasm. Every Sunday they arrive with their collection cans and lists. Instead of a chicken in the pot, it is money out of your pocket. National comrades, give the Nazis everything you have and you can keep the rest for yourselves. Whoever gives his oath to Adolf Hitler has nothing that belongs to himself. On March 20th, we learned about the prospect of a reduction in food rations. Only 300 grams of meat or cold cuts per week. The Führer once asserted he had the right to require sacrifices because he himself was ready to accept any personal sacrifice. If now the idea to starve to death came into his head, I would not want to take away his right to ask all his fellow fighters to do the same. Of course, Kellner had no idea what was happening in the occupied countries at this moment. The food situation in the occupied eastern areas is exceptionally precarious. Thousands and tens of thousands of people are dying of hunger. But none of the Germans would want these people to starve, right? A lady from Dortmund is hoping the English will soon starve to death. She would do well to worry we do not end up with major difficulties feeding ourselves. But it is easier to embrace the opposite hope. Most people have the minds of infants. We went to 5 restaurants trying without success to buy lunch. In Adler restaurants we managed a bowl of thin soup. Germany, you have changed enormously. The National Socialist goblet is not yet completely empty. Only after the last drop is the end near. Before that, we will be eating rutabaga roots. Goebbels was concerned by the food crisis in 1942, as I've mentioned in a previous video, but it looks like he couldn't even paper over the cracks. A visible change has occurred in the newspaper world from 1940 to 1943. The Hamburger Fremdenblatt used to publish an average of 8 to 10 pages in each issue. Today there are at most 4 pages. Obituaries used to be printed in a large layout. Now they take 1/6 of the space. Yes, we have become more modest. The paper supply will likely run out. What luck if such newspapers were no longer available. The ferocious believers would no longer have the accomplishments from Dr. Goebbels and his cohorts to bring up. Unfortunately, it's impossible to say what Goebbels thought about this because his diary entries for the period of the 24th of May to the 6th of June 1942 are lost, but we can assume he wasn't entirely pleased. The increase in children's deaths has been obvious to me for some time already. There are numerous obituaries in Hessische Landeszeitung, especially in the Darmstadt area. Here too, the war is a direct cause. In normal times, there is one physician for every 2,000 to 3,000 people. The army's need for doctors is so great, there are places where 15,000 inhabitants have to get by with one doctor. In his fantastic book, Hitler's Beneficiaries, historian Götz Ali makes the case that the Germans plundered food from all the occupied countries. Many German soldiers denied this after the war, yet it was obvious even to the German civilians what their soldiers were doing in other countries. For the first time in this war, Germany will not be able to rob others for food, but will have to supply their troops from Germany. The destruction of the official economy and the rise of the unofficial economy couldn't be blamed on the National Socialists though, as they picked their favourite scapegoat, the Jews, which was ridiculous by this point. The secret black market is a result of the lack and shortage of goods, and the Nazis have not been able to stop these activities, not even with draconian means. The swipe against the Jews is completely out of place because there are no Jews in Germany anymore. And still, the black market is here. The Jews are no worse than people are in general. It is just that these Nazi hypocrites do not want to see the beam in their own eyes. Anyone in Germany whose food supplies are limited only to what is apportioned cannot be far from complete debilitation. The instinct for self-preservation, which applies to everybody, may force one to disregard the laws and seek repeatedly and carefully how to get the necessary food. This is a dig at Hitler and Mein Kampf, where Hitler said that the Germans would act for the good of the whole, and the Jews were the only ones out for self-preservation. It is also interesting to note because Germany was the best fed country in Axis Europe, since they had stolen all the food from the occupied territories. So if they were struggling to feed themselves and were not far from complete debilitation, it's only imaginable how bad things were elsewhere. See my Greek video for an example of how bad things were. Of all their many promises, the Nazis have kept only one, the eradication of the Jews. The rest, catchphrases. Again, this is an interesting passage because the Holocaust deniers often claim that the Holocaust was Allied propaganda. So, how exactly did Kellner, who was in Germany, fall under the spell of Allied propaganda? Do they have evidence for their claims? No. Our food situation is rather tight. Various posters are hung up suggesting the authorities are greatly striving to provide everything edible for the human diet. Now the battle against homebred caged rabbits has begun. Here and there someone breeds rabbits so he can quietly enjoy some extra meat. Perhaps grains are being used for the hares in urban areas, which would instead be put to use for people. But generally the rabbits are fed waste. Nevertheless, we now have propaganda against the caged rabbits. Well, don't worry, it'll be Christmas soon. The Fifth War Christmas stands at the door. This Christmas will be unusually modest. There is no possibility for buying gifts. Our expenditures allow 30 pfennigs for a small Christmas tree. Merry Christmas. Obituaries of children have been appearing for a long time in nearly every daily newspaper edition. They too are war victims. A lack of doctors and medical supplies prevents rapid assistance. Doctors are in such demand they often must leave even some of the most urgent calls unanswered. In one of our small neighbouring villages, 2 children died in one day because the physician could not get there immediately. Happy New Year. Most shops are closed, partly because the owner was drafted into the armed forces, partly on government orders. A bookshop offers just covers of the books. A poster declares only for those with bomb damage. Some things might be seen in a shop window, but they are mostly window displays or items in a clearance sale. Cheap souvenirs are still found here and there. All in all, it is a picture of disconsolation. One can say we are at the eve of doom. Newspapers will be reduced to 4 pages beginning September 1st. That will affect the obituaries in particular. Then Kellner discovers evidence that confirms what Ali said in Hitler's Beneficiaries. Through a coincidence, we discovered that famine in the evacuated areas can be attributed to the Germans. Upon leaving Krakow, Helvig sent to the courthouse address 15 packages that contained mostly food and beverages. Because the packages arrived in bad condition, the contents were visible, and we reproached Helvig for taking things from there that were already available to him here. Thereupon, Helvig clarified for us that when the camps in Krakow had been evacuated, all the goods were removed too, on orders from above. So, whenever time was available for an evacuation, it was promptly ensured all supplies would disappear. Everything the Germans allowed to occur in the foreign countries will fall back upon Germany. This retribution will not be absent. The German people must pay a heavy penalty for all the horribleness committed in their name. Or the culprits could just blame the Führer rather than taking responsibility for themselves. And indeed, that's what many of them did. So yes, Kellner's diary is an incredibly good primary source document with a lot more to it than what I've selected here. I highly recommend it. Also, here's the promised video about a German Austrian who survived through the war. Link is also in the description in case it doesn't appear on the screen. Make sure you see it because I think it's brilliant. Thanks for watching, bye for now.